Okay, I wanted to do a sharpening video where you can see things a little more from my perspective. I've done the best I can to get the um, everything from my perspective, although being able to see the screen to read your comments and questions while still being able to do it is tricky. So I'm sharpening my knives, and this is after carving maybe 15 spoons, and um, and I use automotive grit sandpaper. This is 600 grit wrapped around a wooden block. This is from my kids' building blocks. This is, you could use a clear piece of 2x4. This I find it easiest to buy as a mixed pack from Amazon. Most hardware stores don't have sandpaper going up to 3,000 grit, and so but it's, for $12 you can get a mix pack ranging from 400 to 3,000, and you'll get a whole bunch of different sheets. So I mix it up. Usually I start with 400. This is 600 because I ran out of 400. It really doesn't matter. And then I basically double the grit until I get up to 3,000. So today I'll be doing 600, 1,200, and then 3,000. And I can tell that I need to sharpen my knife, in part because of the finish that it's giving. It's no longer like a waxy, smooth finish. And in part because right at the tip, it's no longer cleaning up the neck of the spoon as cleanly as I need it to. So that for me is the canary in the coal mine of it's time to sharpen my knife. Now this is a Pro Grind Sloyd from Matt White, Temple Mountain Woodcraft, and you can see it has a hollow grind and then has a rail on either side. And those rails are parallel to one another. So the hollow is down below that level, but those rails form one single flat level. If you guys have questions, I can see the screen just barely, and that's why it's kind of an awkward angle, etc., so that I can do both at once. But basically, I wrap the sandpaper around the block and I pull it down like this. Now, you want to make sure that your fingers are down below that level of the block there. So you don't want to use this, even though you get a more surface area at the same time, because the chance of you cutting the tip of your finger is much higher. So pull it down like this. It actually works nicely that your palm hits the bottom here and really gives you something to push up against. And then the trick is to start at the heel of the blade and go to the tip. And when you're coming towards yourself, you can see that edge of the blade is flat on the sandpaper the entire time. That's really all that matters, is that you keep that edge flat on the sandpaper, and you can feel when it's locked down onto that bevel. When it's back on this bevel, this bit right here, you can see that the edge is not flat on the sandpaper, and then you rock it forward and you see that it is. And the trick is to not rock it further than that. So you lock it onto that bevel and you go from the heel to the tip, just like that. Now when you get to the tip, you can see it would be easy to sort of be off the tip because you have less of a wide surface telling you that you're flat. So that's where watching it as it comes towards yourself is important. And you want to pay attention to sharpening the tip of the knife in particular, because you do so much of the finicky work with the tip of the knife. Now, when you go away from yourself, you can't actually see if you're flat on the bevel, right? So you do it by feel. You place your finger actually on this Sloyd bevel here, not back here, but right up here. And you can feel it. You can even just press your finger, and I'm not holding the handle at all, but I'm pressing it down, and I can feel that bevel is on. And then I go like this. Now you'll notice two things. One, that I'm describing a bit of an arc because the blade has an arc. But the other thing you might not be able to see is that right about here where I hit that curve, I'm also slightly pushing the rotation. Not so much that I roll and create a secondary bevel, but if I don't sort of lean into this part of the pass here, what ends up happening is I end up rocking back off the bevel, because this curve requires essentially a slight rocking motion in the blade as I make that pass. What that translates to is kind of leaning into the blade / lifting the handle like that. Just slightly. Those motions I just made were very exaggerated, but you need to anticipate that that's the motion you need in order to keep this edge truly flat on the sandpaper. Now you can look at your edge, and you can do this with Mora also. You can look at your edge and read into the scratch marks what's going on with your blade. Now, with a Mora, you won't have this hollow grind bit in the middle, so it's actually a little more, a little easier to tell what's going on. The nice thing about the hollow grind is that it keeps your edge from having a sort of a roundedness to it, and it keeps it very flat, which is what you want. But you can look at the scratch marks and see if you're actually creating scratch marks all the way at the tip. And if you aren't, that's a sign that you have poor form. Usually everyone has poor form in the push stroke going away from themselves, because you can't see. When you're coming towards yourself, you're using your eyes and you're visually confirming that you are in fact right, in contact with that tip of the knife there. So coming towards yourself, everyone does pretty well, but going away from yourself is where people, hey Dan, thanks for making this, getting this in my mind to do this. When you're going away from yourself is when people run into trouble, because you aren't seeing the edge of the blade because it's facing away from you. So that's where having your finger actually on this bevel, and you see that even, it's partly my finger is actually resting on the sandpaper. That's how important it is to have it on the bevel. If it's back here even just a little bit, you're going to rock back. So you want to have your finger right there on the bevel. And then you notice that I'm leading with the handle. So the end of the handle is facing in the direction that I'm going here. And then I'm doing that curve to get to the tip. Now the end of the handle is facing the direction I'm going here. And I'm going like that. So I go back and forth, and you're watching those scratch marks. And if your blade is in really rough shape, you're also going to do another thing, which I call the flash method. And that's a method of telling whether you have eliminated your secondary bevel. By secondary bevel, I mean the little rounded bit at the very edge of your knife that if you were to look at it under a microscope would show you that it's not truly a true triangle. You haven't come to a true sharp edge. You have a little rounded over bit. The way you can do the flash method is you put the edge of your blade towards a light source, and your bevel is going to be, let's see if I can get this here. Okay. Your bevel is either going to be all in shadow or all in light. All in shadow, all in light. Now, when it's all in shadow, and you get right to where it's going to be just all in light, if there is a thin... So don't be fooled. What you're seeing here is the track at the very edge of the blade. But if you get to the point where it's about to flash all to light, and you see right before that happens a thin strip of bright light right at the very edge, that's a sign that that secondary bevel, which is catching the light at a slightly different angle because the metal on that bevel is a slightly different angle, that's a sign that that secondary bevel has not been completely eliminated. When you completely eliminate that secondary bevel by going far enough with these passes, with the lowest grit sandpaper, you will no longer see that flash of light. Now, the reason that flash of light is a great technique for telling what your secondary bevel looks like is that it will only show up where you have a secondary bevel. And so you might only have a secondary bevel at the tip of your knife, in which case you can see it disappear. Or you might have a secondary bevel all the way along your knife. But most commonly, because of how people tend to sharpen, what you see is the secondary bevel gets eliminated first down here by the handle and slowly gets eliminated walking its way up. And then the tip is always the last bit to get completely eliminated. Is what I see in most people. So using the flash method to tell sort of how much further you've got to go is the key. So you want to stick with this lowest grit until you are sure that you have eliminated any secondary bevel. So I can tell from the flash method that I don't have a secondary bevel. And by the way, you want to check this with the flash method on both sides. It's hard for me to get the edge facing the light here in a way that I can show you. And quite frankly, this knife doesn't really have a secondary bevel. For me, by the time the tip is no longer doing what I want it to do, it's way before there's any secondary bevel that has been created. So I'm almost never looking for that. Instead, I'm looking at the scratch marks, and I can see if the scratch marks go all the way out to the edge. And particularly if you have these rail lines, what you're looking for is to have the rail lines flash equally. They should equally be. They should both be in shadow, both be in dark. And that's actually not true. I can see that. I can do a flash method here, and see that I'm good. So once you've got that, you then move up a grit in sandpaper. So here I'm going to do 1200. Okay. And the nice thing about the sandpaper is you can shuffle it around and use it all different places. So once you, if you're doubling grits, you pretty much need to do 10 to 15 strokes per side. And I'm using moderate pressure here. And you can see when I'm coming towards myself, my thumb is on the side of the handle. And when I'm going away from myself, my thumb is just back here on the handle, and my finger is the important thing that's on that Sloyd bevel. And so I'm doing my 10 or 15 strokes. So you stick with that lowest grit. It's not 10 or 15 strokes. It's however long it takes to get the geometry correct, right? And now with each successive grit, it's 10 or 15 strokes per side. I actually haven't been paying attention. Because all you're doing is replacing the sort of bigger scratch marks with the finer scratch marks, and that's it. I like to wipe off the blade in between each pass and before I check the blade, because any little bit of dust on the blade will impede my ability to tell if I've gone far enough. So now go up to 3000 grit. Now I used to just do up to 3000 grit and call it a day. And I do think that you can get a perfectly good knife finish with just that. That being said, I've started using strops. I use Tom Scandian strops. And I think any strop you could, if it was a well-made, properly designed strop, you could get good results with it. And I have found that stropping does increase the sharpness of the edge and reduces the amount of sharpening that I need to do. So I would recommend it, but stropping is not a solution. Stropping it won't help you if your sharpening technique is bad. If you don't go far enough and eliminate that secondary bevel, no amount of stropping is going to help you. In fact, stropping might make it worse. You suspect you've spent way too much time on each level of grit. Yeah, possibly, Dan. I mean, ideally, your knife shouldn't get so dull that it takes very long to do it at all. I mean, I sharpen once a week, and I do about 10 or 15 spoons in between. Now, the number of spoons in between has a lot to do with how dry you let your wood get. So I try and carve wood that's fairly dry. It's been in the log for a while, so it's drying as I'm carving it. But you'll notice that I finish my spoons in about an hour. I remove lots of material real fast, so I'm almost always in the sort of soft wood underneath. And if I need to leave my spoon for even as much as half an hour, I'll put it in a plastic bag. I'll get it wet and put it in a plastic bag. It really depends, but I'm sort of jealously guarding the moisture content of my wood. So at 3000 grit, I could leave it here. But because I started stropping, I will strop also. So Tom's strops come in a nice case like this, and I like that because it keeps my toolbox clean. I use Tormek paste on this per his recommendation, although I think now he's recommending Lee Valley Veritas honing compound as like a wax compound that you don't have to scrub off in the same way that this does. But this is what I've got for now. I might change once I run out of this Tormek paste, but for now I've got it. So I keep an old toothbrush and I use it to scrub off any extra sort of glazed bits, right? Keep it nice and fluffy. And here I can see that I actually have plenty, so I don't need to add any more. And even though Tom's strops are designed to be placed on a table and use two hands on them, they have that non-skid base to them. I prefer to continue doing everything in hand. I just need to make sure that my fingers stay nicely below this level. So you see my fingers are below the top level so I don't cut them. At any rate, with stropping, you go away from the edge. So it's a little different motion. It takes a little bit of practice to get comfortable with that. But again, all that matters is that you are getting that edge truly flat on the leather. And you go away from the edge so that you don't cut the leather. Probably you get sloppy from after spending too much time on each level. 10, 15 strokes, good baseline to shoot for. Yeah, I think so, Dan. I think, you're right. Like if you do it for too long, then you're like, oh, it's taking forever. And you sort of start taking shortcuts to make it go quicker. But really, a well-maintained edge shouldn't take much to pull it back. And you'll notice that one of the biggest things I do to protect my edge is that I'm very consistent about always putting a sheath on my blade every single time I put it down, even if it's just for a second. So I don't know how many passes you take on the strop. 10, 15, 20, really just depends. So there's that. That's the suede strop. I'll put that away. So if it had less on it, if it had less compound on it, I would have applied fresh compound, which for the Tormek is this paste here. But again, when I use this up, I'll probably try out that Lee Valley Veritas compound. Neither of those is particularly expensive. I think they're each like $15 or something. So it's important to wipe off the blade before you use it or move on to the next strop, which the final strop is just not a suede strop, but a smooth leather strop with nothing on it. And this has quite a bit of drag. You can sort of see the knife sort of not quite chattering, but has quite a bit of drag on it. And that's actually part of what is having a sharpening effect on the edge. So you can see I'm being as consistent as I can be about going away from the edge in a controlled fashion and keeping that bevel right flat on the suede. Have I found a difference between the different angles of different knives? Mora blade versus a hand forged blade or Matt's Pro Grind? Yeah, I mean, so, Moras tend to be at 28 to 30 degree bevel angle. This one is 24 degrees. So there is a slight difference, and you have to sort of get used to holding your handle in a different way. One of the things I like a lot about Matt's knives is the fact that the handle has these facets. And so it allows you to get that muscle memory of my thumb goes here and it feels this way every single time. And having that consistency of my hand always feels this particular way because it's touching a flat facet is something that you get with this that you don't get with the Mora. And because with the Mora, with that round handle, you depending on where your finger rests on that handle, it will be in a different spot each time. So, okay, so that was my main knife. I'm just going to quickly strop my secondary knife on the leather strop, and then I'm going to do hook knives. Any questions before I move on to hook knives about Sloyd knives, as long as we're on them? One little detail is that it's worth being disciplined about placing the spine first and then rocking onto the edge rather than trying to just get it right off the bat. Because if you try and get it right off the bat, sometimes you might get it, but sometimes you might come edge down first, which just means that you're placing your edge right into that sandpaper or whatever. So you never want to do that. You always want to start and then rock onto the bevel like that. So having a little bit of discipline about always sort of rocking onto the bevel from the back edge will save your edge from damage that you impose yourself. I'm glad you're finding it useful, Dan. Yeah. Okay, so just a couple passes with this one. This is that new hollow grind from Matt where it's truly hollow ground, and you can see it's starting to develop rails just from the act of sharpening. But it won't. The rail is still very, very thin. It's not this wide. I mean, it looks kind of like there's a wide rail, but it's not. It's just a really polished hollow grind. So the rail is just this tiny little thing at the end. Okay, so now let's talk about sharpening hook knives. And in this video, I'm only going to talk about sharpening rail system hook knives. That's what Matt makes because that's what I'm doing right now. If you want to know about sharpening non-rail systems, like a Robin Wood one, I do cover that in one of my videos that's on YouTube. So again, I'm going to start with the 600 grit sandpaper, and I have there we go. I have a length of dowel here, and I'm just gonna I have this on my leg that'll come into play in a second. So I wrap it around, and that ends up using up this little bit that doesn't get used up in any other way. So Matt's knives are designed to be sharpened on the inside, and I'm going to need to move this a little bit more in so you can see. So by putting this on the end, what it means is that this dowel can rest against my hand here. If I were to have this more in the middle and then my hand was holding it off here, then I have to pinch much harder because I'm trying to maintain it. Whereas by having this come up against the butt of my hand, my hand has less fatigue. So palm up, I place this on some hard surface that drops off far enough so that if this rocks back and forth, this dowel can rock back and forth with it. If this was a wider surface like this, then the dowel couldn't rock back and forth because it would hit before it could truly follow this, because this is going to wiggle a little bit. But as long as the dowel can wiggle with it, then the dowel will essentially maintain true contact with both rails and be level. So I start with that lowest grit, and I do kind of a push and a twist. So the push gets me going from one side of the sandpaper to the other, and the twist gets me going from one part of the blade to the other. So just like that. And you can see I will also lift up the handle to help me get to the tip there. Some people do it in two stages. They'll do this, and then they'll lift up and they'll do it there. I like to do it in one fluid motion, just like that. Now the push part is key, because by that push part, what you're also creating is you're creating a burr once you have removed any secondary bevel at the edge of the knife there. So I'm going away from the cutting edge. Remember, I'm a lefty, so the cutting edge is here. I'm going away from the cutting edge. So what happens once I remove that secondary bevel is there's a little bit of a burr that gets pushed off the back. And once I feel that burr all the way down, I'm done with the lowest grit. Don't want to go any further. So I can feel it, except right about there, it's not there. So I'm going to do a little more here. So you can see, this hook knife was not cutting to my standards. It was not achieving a nice clean cut. But to get it from that point back to removing that secondary bevel, it really doesn't take very long. So now we'll go up to the next grit. And again, I can use the same sandpaper, and it just uses up the bit at the end that I can't get for the Sloyd knives. I can't wrap it around the block safely. So it's a nice use of sandpaper, really efficient to do it this way. And again, without removing that burr, I'm just continuing to go, and I'll just do my 10 or 15 passes with this grit sandpaper, right? Now, here I'm using 600, 1200, 3000. Sometimes I do 400, 800, 1500, 3000. Sometimes I do 800, 1500, 3000. It just sort of depends on how much of a secondary bevel you're trying to remove, if you go down to that 400 grit or not, or just what sandpaper you have kicking around. You don't have to go up to 3000. You can go to 2500. So interestingly, the wire edge gradually gets less pronounced as you work your way through the grits, but I still am not touching the wire edge. So now that I've done the 1200 for the correct number, I then do 3000. Okay, just like that. can see how quick this is, and you can see how minimal the equipment is needed to do this. I'm just resting it on the same block that I use for sharpening the Sloyd on my knee, and that works great. And I have this little short section of dowel, it's maybe 8 inches long, that just fits right in my toolbox with everything else. And it's the same sandpaper I use for the other stuff as well. So it's about as minimal as you can get. Okay, so now I want to remove this wire edge. Now, Matt hates it when I show this, but basically I like to do it right here in front of my face, because if I do it here, I can see exactly what angle I'm achieving to remove that wire edge. I'm trying to get it so you can truly see this angle, right? If I go too steep, I'm damaging the edge I just created. If I don't go steep enough, let's see if I can get this there. You see how I'm not actually touching the edge at all. So the goal is to get it right in that sweet spot. And if I get it right in that sweet spot, where, because this is not a true flat bevel here, this actually has a slight curve to it. So as long as I get it right in that sweet spot, I can actually feel that wire edge coming off. There's just like a little bit of resistance, and you can feel it, and then you can also feel it when it's gone. And then you can run your finger this way and feel where you maybe need to go a little further, but always be traveling the sandpaper away from the edge. Does that make sense? So you see how I start, and I generally hold it right up inches from my nose. I can't do it here because the camera's in the way, but and then I can feel that wire edge is gone. So now I also strop my hook knives. I find that makes a big difference. So again, this is the strop stick from Tom Scandian. It has a suede side and a leather side. I really love it. I would highly recommend it to anybody. Same principle. I rest the strop right on the wooden block, and I do a bunch of strokes. Now again, the hook knife I generally sharpen about once a week or every 15-20 spoons. Now these days I've been carving quite a lot, so I actually, I'm carving 7 spoons a day, so now I'm sharpening every other day. But you can see it doesn't take very long. It takes 15 minutes to do a knife and a hook all the way to completion if they don't have any dings on them, because getting dings out takes a long time. So there's that bit. Tricky move, a lot like sharpening a traditional hook knife. Yes, exactly. That's the part where it is like sharpening a traditional hook knife. You see a shiny line along the edge. Yeah, probably, right? Because right there is where I'm going to actually hit that edge, just so. If you round it over too much, then you are changing the angle at which the knife engages with the wood. So you want to be as careful with that as you can be. Again, before I switch to the leather strop, I'm going to use my rag, wipe down the blade, keep all that stropping compound off of, the smooth leather strop. And then this. And you want to make sure that you're doing the push as well as the twist, because otherwise you will, if you just do the twist, you'll end up cutting the leather on your strop. So the push is what keeps you from damaging your strop as well. And there's quite a bit of drag here. And then there shouldn't be a wire edge on the edge of the blade just from stropping, but it might be that there might be a tiny little one, depending on how thoroughly you remove the wire edge from the last time. So if you want to, you can do that same technique. Of watching that angle and then going away from the edge. Yeah, and there we go. And that is how I sharpen my hook knives, and then always sheath it. So that's that, guys. I'm gonna see if I can post this to YouTube as well, but thanks for watching.